sir.
Yes. Is there a question?
Yes, sir.
Yes, go ahead. Who's this?
Sir, the babbling equilibrium in the Crawford-Sobel model is the same equilibrium which we'll get under if the agent chooses to remain silent. Is it?
Um,
Silence and babbling are equivalent in the Crawford-Sobel model.
no, no, there's a subtle difference. Yes. What is a babbling equilibrium? A babbling equilibrium is an equilibrium where you are free to speak. There's no scotch tape on your mouth. Yes, you're playing a game with me. You have some information which I don't. You are free to tell me something, to pass a message on to me. Okay? So there's no exogenous restriction on your speech. It turns out that the conflict of interest between you and me is so large that I don't believe anything you say. I don't read any meaning into what you say. I say, oh, he'll always say this in all situations, under all states of the world. So let me just ignore that. So you're free to send a message. In equilibrium, your message has no meaning to the listener because of conflicting preferences and all that, because of credibility problems. Now, a commitment to silence is something else. Commitment to silence is even before you as a speaker have received your information, you have using some sort of institutional mechanism, like, for example, passing a law, like the Official Secrets Act is something like a commitment to silence, right? You have set up the rules of the game so that you cannot communicate even if you wish. So silence, in the sense that I have been talking about, is an ex-ante commitment to not pass any messages. Whereas a babbling equilibrium is an endogenous outcome where you're literally free to speak, but what you say doesn't convey any information for endogenous reasons. I don't believe you. Right?
But the receiver's final actions will be the same under both.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But the difference is critical.
The silence can be more informative, right? So, I mean,
Okay, so silence can be more informative. That arose in another context where the message is not cheap talk, but the message is producing some documentary evidence. For example, whether you have a certain certificate of quality as a seller, whether you have a certain degree as a job applicant, and so on, right? So in that context, I also said, silence means something. But that was a slightly different kind of context. Yeah, so there are these different shades of meaning, and I hope I'm not making things too unclear, right? One illustration of this, going back to cheap talk, one illustration is the story, as I said, of the boy who cried wolf. Yes, every day he's cried wolf, wolf, and the villagers came running, and they found that he was just having a bit of fun at their expense. There was no wolf, he was lying. So over time they started ignoring his messages. He said wolf, wolf, and they thought that he's just kidding. There really is no wolf and no threat. So his message lost meaning. Okay, now imagine that the villagers put a scotch tape on his mouth when he went out to tend to his flock of sheep, like in this Asterix comics, right? This cacophonix, this character, they often sort of tie him up so that he can't play his atrocious music. So if they put scotch tape on his mouth, that would be forcing him to be silent. So in the game where he was free to cry wolf, his message still didn't convey any information. Yes. Whereas if they put scotch tape on his mouth, then he would be forced into silence, and there again he won't be able to communicate any information, but because it was exogenously imposed on him from the outset. So a commitment to silence and a meaningless babbling message in equilibrium are different things in this sense. Okay. So babbling equilibrium in some sense is a tragedy, that we are free to speak. We are free to convey information to others, but because of our own incentives and our temptation to game the situation and to deceive others, what we say has lost meaning, right? Nobody has suppressed our speech. We ourselves have shot our credibility. So that is a very important and critical difference. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so let's look at this paper today. So here are some examples. People sometimes withhold unambiguously good news about themselves. So here are 3 examples. It is said that the old rich, people who are rich for many generations, they often do not flaunt their wealth. Celebrities who are very big, they often dress down, they come in jeans and t-shirt and what have you. Yeah. Great scholars act humble. They avoid titles. They don't go around telling people that I've won this award or I have a degree from this great institution, etc., etc. One concept in marketing is the concept of soft selling. That if you're trying to sell a very high-end brand, right, a product which sits at the very top of the quality ladder, then don't do a very splashy, conspicuous ad campaign. Do soft selling. If you have to advertise at all, tone it down, right? Don't go to town about how great a product you have. So these are kind of observations that we have, and I think most of us would identify with these examples. They probably ring a bell. So the question is why? Now, one answer is, these people are modest. Great scholars acting humble. You meet Kenneth Arrow and then you come away saying that, well, God bless his soul, he has passed away. But people often said about Kenneth Arrow that, he was so down to earth that you wouldn't be able to tell that this is such a giant in economics. So one answer is, well, they're genuinely modest. We think highly of them. They don't necessarily think highly of themselves or think about it or obsess about it. They go on with their interests. But there can be another sort of more tricky reason why people don't always advertise good news about themselves. And that is strategic modesty, right? Modesty can turn out to be a form of bragging, actually. Yes. So you run into a great scholar and you, in some gathering, some dinner party or something, and you have a conversation. And then sometime later you learn that this person has won the Nobel Prize. And then you're doubly impressed. You say, oh, wow, such a great scholar won the Nobel Prize, but also so modest. Right? I didn't have any inkling that this person was so great in his discipline when I came across him at this dinner party. Right? So there's a double boost to the reputation of the person. How can we understand this sort of false modesty phenomenon? Right? This is not to say that there aren't genuinely modest people. But sometimes modesty can be used strategically for self-promotion, right? And that's the kind of thing that we are going to try and understand. And here's the outline of the model or the reasoning. There are sources of information apart from self-disclosure. Yes. So let me flesh out one more example for you. So, there's some young actor who has gone to some party of film professionals, right? Bollywood or Hollywood party. And the actor has graduated from some top schools like the National School of Drama, yes, NSD. So that's a big achievement. That's a certification. Uh, so at this party where there are directors, producers, other actors, the actor could sort of let it be known that he has graduated from the NSD. Yeah. But the actor doesn't say so. He just goes around, acts modest, does not mention that he has this degree. And then sometime later, the actor has done his first film. And then we find out sometime later when we open the morning newspaper that this actor has won some top prize, maybe the Oscar, national award for best actor, or some such top prize. And that sort of information, you don't have to, if you win a top prize, you don't have to say, others say it for you, right? It's announced prominently in the media. So when the film producers, they hear about this, then again, as I said, they're impressed on two fronts. That, oh, this actor has won such a top prize, what was the Oscar winner for his first film. Wow. But also that, at the dinner party, when we met him, he didn't mention his credentials. He didn't mention that he's come out of this top film school or drama school. He was so modest. And the argument is that the modesty is a sign of confidence. That the actor is betting that even if he is not self-promoting and talking about his achievements like his prestigious degree, people will come to know about his accomplishments anyway in the future. And when they come to know, they'll have this kind of double, they'll be impressed on two counts rather than just one count. So by suppressing the news about his degree and so on, he is portraying confidence that we will anyway come to learn about his abilities, right? And that's the way in which he's signaling his ability, that I don't need to go out and brag about my relatively smaller achievements. My bigger achievements will come to the fore anyway. And I'm confident about that. So that is what is false modesty, right? It's or strategic modesty, if you will. So we'll see that in a simple model. The model is a little different from a paper, which I've cooked up to keep things simple. And then in the end, we'll talk about, these are relatively trivial examples. But as I said in the beginning, that studying these sorts of disclosure games or evidence presentation has a bearing on more serious issues like whether companies should what kind of financial disclosure laws we want to have, what kind of product labeling laws should we have. So all of this has some bearing on those policy questions too. Okay. And these bullet points sort of give you the outline of what I just said. There are sources of information apart from self-disclosure. Withholding initial good news serves as a signal of confidence in the outcome of subsequent signals, right? And as you will see in the model, bragging separates the mediocre from the bad. Yes, Churchill once said, I think, well, almost all things are attributed to Churchill or Oscar Wilde or Mark Twain. So apparently Churchill said about one of his political opponents that he's a modest man with much to be modest about, right? So when people brag or they flaunt smaller accomplishments, like say a degree they have acquired, they're separating themselves from the band. They're separating themselves from ones who are modest because they don't have a choice. But modesty, or within quotes, modesty, separates the good from the mediocre. The very good practice modesty for strategic reasons, so that they can separate themselves from the mediocre. Yeah. And as you will see that this, if we can find that false modesty may arise in equilibrium, then that would mean that, that unraveling theorem of Milgram and Roberts has failed. Unraveling theorem, all information sitting out there will spill out. That's what the unraveling theorem said. So when people in equilibrium withhold things like, their NSD degree, the unraveling theorem has failed. And when we get to welfare, there is a case perhaps to be made for mandatory disclosure rules because the unraveling theorem has failed. So I'll talk about that in the end. Okay, so here's a very simple model. Yes. So the sender is a worker whose productivity is unknown. So that's our actor. R is a competitive employer. So these are like producers and directors who may consider recruiting this actor for a movie project. Action A is the offered wage. Yeah. And there's competition among the producers, and that means that the representative R, receiver, will pay a wage which is equal to the expected productivity of the sender. Right? Now, here's the ability distribution. Theta can take three values, low, medium, or high, and the values are 0, half, and 1. So these are the productivity levels. So there's a low type, there's a medium type, there's a high type. And initially, there are proportions or probabilities, interchangeable interpretations. They are alpha. So alpha is the probability of a low type, beta is the probability of a high type, and this is the probability of a medium type. What are the preferences? Receiver's preferences, these are standard, quadratic kind of preferences. Would like to choose an action to match the state. So in a full information world, low types would be paid a wage of 0, medium types would be paid a wage of half, high types 1. Yes. And what's the sender's payoff? Well, increasing in A, right? For the actor, getting as high a wage as possible is desirable, no matter whether he's a good actor or not. Yeah. So in terms of our bias B, there's an infinite bias. Yes. So the moment we got to the Milgram-Roberts evidence disclosure model, we have been assuming infinite bias. So we're sticking with that assumption. And infinite bias, of course, makes the credibility problem severe. In a cheap talk game, all you'll have is babbling. So let's see what happens here. And under Milgram-Roberts assumptions, you have full disclosure. So let's see what happens here. Right? Something in between will happen. Now, completing the description of the model, the M and the H types have some evidence, piece of documentary evidence, E, like a PhD degree or the degree from NSD and so on. Low types don't have that degree. So the degree separates the low type from the rest. Yes. And both M and H have it in their pockets. They're carrying that piece of paper. It's just whether they want to show it to you or not. That's the choice that they have. And not showing it would be modesty. Yeah, here. Okay. So they possess the evidence with probability 1. So we are removing that factor that maybe the evidence does not exist. There's some uncertainty. That's not there in this model. Yeah, that's out of the picture. Now, there will also be some exogenous noisy signal which tends to pick out the H types, but with noise. What does that mean? That this exogenous signal can take one of two values, which is small h and small ml. The H types get the H signal with probability p, and this signal with probability 1 minus p. The ML types, it is reverse, right? So if p were 1, then this signal would be perfect, not noisy, and it would separate the high type from the rest. right? The degree or this piece of evidence E separates the low type from the rest perfectly. This other signal, which is exogenous, it separates the high type from the rest, but not perfectly with noise. Okay, so to fit with our story, the high signal here is like winning an Oscar or winning the National Best Actors Award, right? It's the big splashy award which comes in the newspapers. That's what this signal is. And it has noise, we know that these things can be noisy. If you look at the list of Nobel Prizes in many disciplines, it's some of the greatest writers of the 20th century didn't win it. Yes, you don't have Tolstoy there, you don't have Kafka there, although Kafka died in obscurity before he became famous. You don't have Borges there, and so on. Mahatma Gandhi didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. Henry Kissinger won it, right? So all of those justify in saying P and 1 minus P are all interior. Yes, mistakes are made in these awards being given out. Now, so this is how the game goes. First, the type is realized, right? The actor learns whether he himself is high, medium, or low type. Then this piece of evidence E comes through, right? The medium and the high types, they get this degree. And then they go to their dinner party and then they choose whether to reveal E or not, okay? Whether to brag or whether to be modest. And then this exogenous signal comes through. It appears, right? The Oscars are announced. And then at the final stage, the other people, those are the receiver, right? The producers and whoever, they do their Bayesian updating about whether this actor is low, medium, or high. And then they pay out their waves. And then the game ends. Yes? That's the game. Is that clear? Any questions? Everything clear?
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, why doesn't the sender know the realization of the signal?
I think the sender, of course, eventually the signal will come, right? What I meant to say, and it's awkwardly phrased, is that at the time when the sender decides whether to produce the evidence E or not, if he has it, okay, at that time, he doesn't know what this signal realization is.
Okay.
So this party the actor is attending is happening before Oscars. Yes?
Yes, sir.
On Oscar night, everybody will know who got the prize. So everybody will get to see the signal. Okay. Now, we want to try and construct a separating equilibrium. Yes, the focus is on whether the agent, the actor, reveals this piece of evidence, this degree, or not. Yes. Can we construct a separating equilibrium? Because a separating equilibrium is going to be the foundation of our notion of false modesty, right? Whether completely rational and egotistical actors can practice false modesty. So we can only game theoretically rationalize it if we can construct a separating equilibrium, meaning in an equilibrium which has the following strategic feature. The medium types disclose E, the high types do not. The high types take a gamble that the subsequent signal, the Oscar award, will go in their favor. Yes. So is it possible to construct a separating equilibrium like this? Under some conditions, yes. So I'm going to show you that. Okay, what if the agent discloses E, right? Immediately, the agent's wage or payoff for the action is determined. It's half, right? Because half, remember, is the marginal, the value of the medium type, yes, productivity. So if this is the strategy, then the moment we see E, the moment the producers see that, this guy is bragging about his NSD degree, immediately they know that this is a mediocre type M, not an H type, because in this equilibrium, the H type doesn't do it. So Bayesian updating leads to corner beliefs. Yes. And so since it's a middle type, the expected productivity is half. So that's the wage. Okay. Now, more tricky is what happens if E is not disclosed. Okay. That means either this is an H type or this is an L type. The L type didn't disclose because the L type cannot. The L type doesn't have E, the degree. And the H type has it, but it's his strategy not to show it to you. So the subsequent Bayesian updating will put positive probability only on high and low, not on middle. Okay. So what are these probabilities, right? That's pi H and pi ML. Okay. So E was not shown. Then the Oscars are announced. That noisy signal comes through. It can take two values, H, the guy won the Oscar, or ML, he didn't want to win it. Pi H and pi ML are the posterior beliefs depending on the signal realization. So why is it like this? Let's look at pi H. Okay, so what are we updating on? We are updating on the two pieces of information. This guy didn't produce the E, A, and B, he won the Oscar. All right. So this event can happen in two ways. One is that he's a high type and justly won the Oscar. Second is he's actually a low type and won the Oscar by accident. So that probability is alpha times 1 minus p, whereas the first probability is beta times p. So this is our Bayes updating rule. Okay. Now, if the signal realization was different, if we saw that he didn't show us any NSD degree and didn't win the Oscar, what's the likelihood he's a high type? Well, this event can happen in two ways. One is that he's genuinely good, but was unlucky, missed out on the Oscar, deserved it, but they didn't give it to him. And secondly, that he's actually a bad actor and quite justifiably didn't win the Oscar. Right. So again, this is Bayes updating. So these are the updated beliefs after the signal realization, the two possible signal realizations that we are looking at a high type. Okay. Now remember, the high type productivity is 1 and the low type productivity is 0. So the high type's expected productivity will be nothing but this pi. And that is therefore the wage that the market will pay. Yes, or the receiver will pay. So the action taken after a H signal is the same as this probability, and so under the other signal. So these are the contingent wages. Somebody doesn't show the piece of evidence E, and then either wins the Oscar or not. If they win the Oscar, this is the wage they'll get. If they don't win the Oscar, this is the wage they'll get. Okay? Questions? Everything clear? All right. Now, to check the incentive constraints and the best response properties, we have to go beyond contingent wages. Because after all, at the time when he's deciding whether or not to show the degree and brag about it, he doesn't know which of these two wages he's going to get. Okay, he knows that if he wins the Oscar, this is what he'll get. If he doesn't win, this is what he'll get. But these have to be weighed by the probabilities of winning the Oscar, right? And that's where the difference between the high type and the medium type and everybody will come in. That high type anticipates a high probability of receiving this wage, and the medium type a relatively lower probability. So let's write down those expressions. This is the expected wage or expected action for the high type if he suppresses E. Okay, with probability P, he'll win the Oscar and get that contingent wage. Probability 1 minus P, he won't, and get this wage. Right? So you throw in the calculation from the previous slide, you get some expression. Now, this is a typo here. This should have been M type. Okay. So what if the M type, in equilibrium, the M type is supposed to brag and not be modest. But modesty is also an option for the M type. The M type could also keep the piece of paper in his pocket and not show it to anybody. So what if he did that? What would be his expected payoff? Well, it would be a weighted average of the same two contingent wages that we calculated, but the probabilities will be flipped, right? The M type knows that there's a much lower chance of him winning the Oscar. His career will really take off if he does, but he doesn't see a very high chance of that happening. Whereas there's a much higher chance that he won't win the Oscar and will have to settle for a low wage. Okay. So again, you substitute the expressions from the previous slide and you get something. Now notice that, this will always be larger than this, because the wage after winning an Oscar will always be higher. And in this expectation, the higher wage carries a higher probability weight. Here, the higher wage carries a lesser weight. So obviously, this expectation will be less than this expectation. So, and you can check that with algebra. Intuitively, it should be obvious to you, but if you want to check the math, you just subtract those two expressions and verify that it's strictly positive. Okay. Now, this is the condition for a separating equilibrium. All right. If the expected weight of the medium type is less than half and the expected weight of the high type for non-disclosure is greater than half, then our separating equilibrium is a valid one. Why? Because whoever deviates and shows the degree, even if the high type deviates and shows the degree, people will think they're medium type, right? So they'll pay them a wage of half, right? Even though they deserve more. So half is always the safe option that both the high and the medium types have, okay? If these inequalities are true, then the medium type doesn't want to take the gamble of being modest, because in expectation, he'll get less than half. So he'll settle for the half by bragging. The high type expects a higher payoff from strategic modesty than half. So that's why the high type will practice strategic modesty, right? So all we need to guarantee is that these two expectations, which we have expressed in terms of parameters or fundamentals of the model, we just have to make sure that they lie on either side of half, and that'll validate our separating equilibrium. Yes? Now, can it ever be true? Yes, one minimal condition that we need to be able to have a situation like that is this expectation has to be less than that expectation, but that's always true. We have verified, right? So the medium types expected earnings from non-disclosure will always be less than the other types. The only problem is that both of them could end up being on one side of half, and then our separating equilibrium breaks down, right? Let's look at some limiting cases though. As P goes to half, what does that mean? That means that exogenous signal is almost pure noise. Oscars are almost lotteries, right? People who give out Oscars don't have much of a clue. They almost randomly give out the awards. Suppose, yes. Then what happens? Both of these expectations approach the same value. Again, you can just mechanically verify that. Yes, but intuitively, it's very easy to see, because look, the difference between them arises because the probability weights are flipped. The chance of winning an Oscar is flipped around in these two expressions. But if P is half, the two weights are half anyway. So there's no difference between these two expectations, right? So either both of them will be less than half, or both of them will be higher than half, and in any case, we won't be able to construct a separating equilibrium. So that means that the exogenous signal can be noisy, but it can't be too noisy for this sort of situation to arise, false modesty situations. Now, what if we pull P to the other end, make it nearly perfect, right? The noise element is very, very small. So P tending to 1. And then again, mechanically, you can check that the two expectations approach the two ends, 0 and 1. Yes, and that's also very easy to see. If only great actors always win Oscars, right, or almost always, then winning an Oscar is a tremendous certificate that this is almost surely a high type. So this wage will be close to 1, and this wage will be close to 0. Yes. So P equal to 1 means great actors almost surely win Oscars, and bad actors almost never win Oscars. Yes. So obviously this will approach 1 because this contingent wage on winning is approaching 1, and the probability attached to it is also approaching 1. Whereas here it will be 0, right? So if the noise in the signal is low enough, then this separating equilibrium will necessarily exist, right? We don't even have to rely on the values of alpha, beta, all I need is have a signal which is sufficiently less noisy. Yes. All right. So we are not talking of an empty set here. For exogenous information like awards and stuff, which have low noise, if that exists in the environment, strategic modesty will arise in equilibrium. Yeah. Now, another kind of limiting or comparative static result, think about when alpha tends to 0. What is alpha? Alpha is the proportion of low types in the population, right? Remember? What's the probability a randomly selected agent is low type? That's alpha. So as alpha goes to 0, you can again mechanically check that the two expectations both tend to 1, right? And therefore both are strictly greater than half. And then again, your separating equilibrium is going to break down. What's the intuition? The intuition is, let me state it very broadly. Why do the medium types brag? The medium types brag. See, bragging separates you from the low type. And modesty is an attempt to separate yourself from the medium type. Modesty is an instrument to separate you from M, and bragging, showing your degree, your lesser achievements, is an instrument to separate yourself from the low type. Okay. Now, if alpha is very small, the need to separate from the low type is not very strong. You're in an environment where very few people are low types. You've gone to an exclusive party where very few of the attendees are not good actors, right? As a scholar, as an academic, you've gone to a party where very few people, where almost everyone has a higher degree, like PhD, okay? So that's why our false modesty equilibrium breaks down when alpha is very low. Yes. And then you can only have a pooling equilibrium, perhaps, where, show your degree or something. Modesty doesn't have any information content in these sorts of environments. Okay. Now, in this paper, they provide a nice, cute illustration of this with some evidence by cooking up a little field experiment. Right? So that's what I will tell you now. The title of this slide is very ill-advised. Okay. Interestingly, if you look at the paper, the two authors are Rick Harbaugh and Ted Toe. Anyway, I'll tell you that later. So what is the experiment they cooked up? Okay. In the University of California system, there are many, many universities. Right? There are campuses like Berkeley, for example, world famous, right? A very high quality university. But then there are sort of lesser branches of the University of California system. Now, some of these are campuses like Berkeley, which have doctoral programs, right? They're PhD programs themselves. And no wonder almost all their faculty have PhD degrees, right? It's almost a requirement to get a job there as a faculty member. But in some of the sort of less prestigious campuses, if you will, which do not have their own PhD programs, right? They have a relatively higher fraction of the faculty who don't have PhDs, right? Their highest degree is probably master. So in that sense, alpha is small in campuses like Berkeley. It's vanishingly small. And it's relatively large in some of these other campuses, right? So what does our theory tell us? Our theory tells us that strategic modesty comes into effect when alpha is large enough, when there's sufficiently large number of low types, right? So if you think of people without PhD degrees as low types, the kind of equilibrium we discussed with strategic modesty can be expected to prevail in universities of the second kind, not your Berkeleys, but the lesser campuses where 20–30% may have no PhDs. Whereas at the top end, like Berkeley or San Diego and so on, false modesty is unlikely to arise as a phenomenon. Yes, you need a sufficiently high number of low types for this sort of separating equilibrium to come into place. So what they did is they looked at whether people self-describe themselves as doctors or write PhDs after their name, whether they feel compelled to brag or not. Yes. And the prediction of the theory and model is that you would expect that sort of phenomenon where alpha is relatively high, namely in the lesser campuses. Yes, so-called lesser campuses, let's say. So what they did is they downloaded the syllabus for various courses from these universities' websites, right? So they downloaded a whole bunch of syllabuses from Berkeley and San Diego and from these other places, and see what's the proportion of faculty members who on their course syllabus call themselves doctor or PhD. And another source of information was they called their office telephones to listen to their voice messages. You have reached the office of Dr. So-and-so or just the name. Okay, so here's some summary stats. In the so-called lesser campuses, the non-doctoral universities, which don't have high-level degree programs of their own, first of all, there were a lot of, the full-time faculty was only about half. So about half was not full-time, part-time faculty. But in the Berkeley type campuses, most faculty members were full-time, right? But more pertinently, look at the percentage of faculty members who had PhDs. Okay, so non-PhDs were a full 20% in the smaller campuses, but they were virtually absent in the Berkeley type campuses, right? Almost everybody had PhDs, barring very small. I mean, that 2% is also perhaps, faculty members who are about to finish their PhD, is my guess. So this is among full-time faculty, and among part-time faculty, it's even more stark. In Berkeley, there is some part-time faculty, uh, uh, about 20%. But there's no data for that. But anyway, in the non-doctoral programs, about half their faculty members are part-time. And among the part-timers, very few actually have PhD. So there are lots of people walking around on these campuses who are members of the faculty, but they don't hold PhD degrees. Whereas in campuses like Berkeley, it's very, very rare. Right? That's what this is saying. Now, here's the behavior differences. That's in the next table. So, do they call themselves doctor in their voicemail titles? A full quarter of them do so in the non-doctoral places, right? But in the doctoral, places like Berkeley, almost nobody calls themselves doctor. Yes. And similarly, in the syllabus title, 3/4 of them calls themselves doctor. But in Berkeley, somehow on the syllabus, there's more mention of doctor, but still there's a substantial gap. And there's a statistically significant difference between these proportions. I put the star in the wrong places. I should have put it here. So Dr. Ghosh doesn't know that much econometrics clearly. But these differences are statistically significant given the sample size at a very high level, right? 1% level. So that's some confirmation that whether or not people put out little dollops of favorable information about themselves, like having a degree or having some limited success in some field, depends very much on the environment and what they're trying to signal and who they're trying to separate from. Right? Questions? Anything? No? Everybody's being very modest. No questions? All right. Now, of course, the purpose of sort of studying these things is, as I said, can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Maybe I've lost connection. There's such a you've taken this commitment to silence very seriously, you guys. You want to just play a babbling equilibrium or a silence, commit to silence. Anyway. Okay, now what we have in mind through all of this is sort of policy issues like, compulsory certification or not, compulsory company financial disclosure laws or not, etc. So let's take this little model and let's pose that question in the context of this model. That imagine a law is passed which says that you have to disclose E if you have it. Now, it'll be an odd thing to pass in the context of, passing a law saying actors have to show their degrees in every social party they go to. That will be silly. But as I said, in the more serious applications, it's indeed a policy question. So suppose we pass a law like that. Is it good? Good for whom? Well, good for the receiver or not? And the answer I'm going to provide is that, well, it may or may not be, but in some situations, compulsory disclosure laws can improve receivers' welfare. Yeah. Now, there's a trade-off. So let me spell it out at the outset. Mandatory disclosure, like mandatory product labeling, adds information, right? So in terms of our model, L becomes perfectly identified. In the equilibrium, I'm going to assume that the separating equilibrium exists. In that equilibrium, M, the medium type, was perfectly identified because the medium type blotted out and bragged. And so was identified with probability 1. There was some possibility of H and L types getting mixed up by the receiver. Yes. Now, if there's a compulsory disclosure rule, then L will be perfectly identified. Everybody who has E has to show it. So whoever doesn't show it is an L type. But M is no longer perfectly identified because strategic modesty has been banned by law. At the end of the day, the receiver will still be slightly confused between the H type and the M type, right? Because after all, that final signal is noisy, right? It's not a perfect mark. So that's the trade-off. In a voluntary disclosure regime, M is perfectly identified, L is not. In a compulsory disclosure regime, L is perfectly identified, but M is not. So how do these two things compare from the receiver's perspective? Okay, here's a specific example. Suppose there's an equal fraction of all types. Alpha, beta is 1/3. You can go back and look at the expressions we derived for compulsory, for conditional wages. You'll find that, there are P and 1 minus P. And you can, again, use the same expressions with these values. And you'll find that the two expectations are of this form. And one is greater than half and the other is less than half. So a separating equilibrium exists. And in that separating equilibrium, the receiver's payoff is given by this, right? You can calculate it in the standard way. And then you switch to the other regime, the mandatory disclosure regime, right? And these are the conditional wages, okay? So anybody who does not show or doesn't have the piece of evidence, the degree E, is immediately identified as the L type. So they get a 0 wage. The high and the medium types pool together, okay? Now these are the two wages depending on the value of that final signal, right? Whether the guy wins the Oscar or doesn't win the Oscar. These are the contingent wages. Why? Because because winning an Oscar means, from Bayesian updating, that this is a high type with probability P and has a productivity 1. And not winning an Oscar means it's a medium type, not a low type, a medium type with probability 1 minus P. And then productivity is half. And here the probabilities are reversed. Okay, now, what is the receiver's payoff in this situation with compulsory disclosure? It's that expected squared error term thing, right? So that's here. If it's a high type, which has probability 1/3, this is the expected payoff of the receiver. Why? Because if the high type wins the Oscar, they're paid this wage, but their true productivity is 1, so that gap squared. And if the high type doesn't win the Oscar, then this is the squared error, right? And that probability is here. Similarly, for the medium type, right, you have the same thing. Now, there's also another term, 1/3 times, receiver's payoff if it's a low type. But when it's a low type, receiver's payoff is 0, right? Because the low type is perfectly identified, so the wage is equal to 0 anyway. So you simplify this, you get this expression, 1/6 of P times 1 minus P. That turns out to be less than 2/3 of P times 1 minus P, because that was the payoff, if you remember, in the separating equilibrium. under a voluntary disclosure regime. Yes. Okay, so I have showed you an example where this trade-off, that if, it's an environment where some available information is being voluntarily suppressed for reasons of strategic modesty, we can pass a law which makes it compulsory to release that sort of information and make it public. And that creates a trade-off between, one way to put it is, um, um, when the government passes a law saying the companies have to, release their audited accounts to the public, companies have to put this kind of information on their product labels, etc. There's some direct release of extra information, yes. But information also reaches consumers through things like signaling, like soft selling approaches and stuff like that, right? And that kind of indirect release of information through signaling, whether or not to show certain kinds of information, that information is suppressed. And this example is showing that, it can go either way. And there's, in some situations, for some parameter values, the compulsory direct release of information can matter more than the signaling that has been suppressed. Yes. So we shouldn't kind of have this sort of, sweeping, what seemed to be like a tempting conclusion based on the unraveling theorem, that don't bother with trying to, enforce laws. Like, the information will reach the consumers and the citizens anyway. That has to be taken with caution. Right? Sometimes, in spite of signaling, there's so much information suppression that some sort of compulsory disclosure laws can be beneficial. Okay. Any questions? Wow. I finished early and you guys have your lips sealed. What is special about today? All right, so let me end recording of this lecture first.